On this special episode of Movie Geeks United, we welcome returning guest, Academy Award winning editor Paul Hirsch. In a 50-year career, Mr. Hirsch has made indelible contributions to the landscape of popular American culture through his brilliant command of the medium of film editing, as evidenced in such films as Phantom of the Paradise, Carrie, The Fury, Footloose, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, Mission Impossible, the first and fourth chapters of that series, Steel Magnolias, the biopic of Ray Charles, Ray, which netted him another Oscar nomination. In addition to all of this, Mr. Hirsch is also responsible for co-editing the original 1977 film Star Wars, for which he won an Oscar, and its sequel, The Empire Strikes Back. Mr. Hirsch joins us to celebrate the 40th anniversary of The Empire Strikes Back in this special episode. And what always also we're going to begin here by telling listeners that you do have a book. It's entitled A Long Time Ago in a Cutting Room Far, Far Away. It is a terrific memoir. It is brimming with both insights and humanity. And it's a great peek into the process of filmmaking. I found it to be utterly fascinating, and I'm sure I will be reading it again. So I want to recommend all of our listeners out there to, if they can, pick up a copy of this book. It is more than recommended. So there we go. So what I'll
Thank
do
you
is
very much.
yes, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Adam.
You are quite welcome. And I meant all of it. It's true. Um, what I wanted to do, though, basically was just give you an opportunity to basically give us a quick recap of the events leading up to your editing of Star Wars. And, you know, you don't have to, you can tell as much or as little as you want to, whatever suits you. But I just wanted to give our listeners a little bit of the basic background as to how you got to Star Wars. And then we can jump from there to Empire Strikes Back.
Yeah. Well, I go into this in great detail in the book, as you know, and
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to know exactly where the story begins, but suffice it to say that in 1971, Brian De Palma and George Lucas were both directing films on the Warner Brothers lot, and they became friendly because they were the youngest directors on the lot. And the friendship began then. And subsequently, I edited a picture for Brian called Sisters. And um, the following picture that we did together was called Phantom of the Paradise. And there was a screening at the 20th Century Fox lot of Phantom of the Paradise. And George and his wife, Marcia, who was a film editor herself, were at the screening. And I made George's acquaintance then. And he told me he liked my work, and I said, thank you very much. And that was sort of that. And then sometime later, I was working with Brian. Maybe I wasn't, I'm a little hazy on the chronography of this bit, but I got a call from Marcia Lucas. I was living in New York at the time, was based in New York, and Marcia lived out in California, and she was working on Taxi Driver. So I guess this would have been in 1970, 75, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
She called and she said, we need help editing Taxi Driver. Are you available to come work on it? Because you know, you've worked with Bernard Herrmann, and it would be a great help to have you on the picture. And I said, yeah, absolutely. And she called back the next day and she said the studio wouldn't allow it. They said they have enough editors in California. They're not going to pay to bring an editor from New York to work on the picture. So that was that. So then after Phantom of the Paradise, I did a picture with Brian called Obsession. And then we did another picture that was to follow called Carrie. And George was getting ready to shoot Star Wars at the same time. And I was hired by Brian to do Carrie, and George went off to England to shoot Star Wars. And Marcia was one of the editors on Star Wars. On the completion of principal photography in England, George and Marcia came back to the States through New York. And Brian and I had finished our cut of Carrie. We screened it for them, and they liked it very much. And a couple of weeks later, I got a phone call from Marcia. Um, they had fired their editor in England because George was unhappy with the cut. And Marcia called and she said, we're recutting the picture. Are you available to come work on the picture? And I said, am I going to get a call from the studio again tomorrow saying it's not going to be possible? And she said, no, this is a different situation. And so that's how I wound up working on the picture. And I had to finish Carrie first. So I began work on Star Wars around the end of September 1976. And Marcia and Richard Chu had already started helping out on the picture as well. And the three of us worked together through October, November, December. My deal was up at the end of the year. And around December, Marty Scorsese had been cutting his picture, New York, New York, starring Bob De Niro and Liza Minnelli in Los Angeles, and his editor passed away. So he called Marcia to find out if she could come and take over the picture. And she spoke to George, and George said, well, I think it's fine because I'm ready to cut the picture with just one editor at this point. And as she was telling me this, I thought she was going to say, well, goodbye and good luck. Thank you very much, because my deal was up at the end of the year. And I assumed that Richard Chu, who had been hired before me, would be staying on. But it turned out that George decided he wanted to finish the picture with me. And I didn't know that Richard had been hired on the same basis as me, only through the end of the year. So I wound up being the editor on the picture from January to the release in May, during which time we did a lot of polishing, of course, and then there was a bit of reshooting, new shooting, additional shooting that took place during post to fill in some of the gaps in the story that we needed to cover. So that was basically it. And then when the sequel was planned, Gary Kurtz, the producer, asked me if I wanted to work on it. I said, of course, Although George had decided not to direct the sequel because it had been an enormous strain on him. The first picture had been very difficult for him, and he didn't want to go through it again. And a friend of his named Matthew Robbins had worked for Irvin Kershner, and Kirsch had already directed a big budget sequel to a hit movie. He did the sequel to A Man Called Horse. Mm-hmm. And he had performed really well, and George met him and liked him and hired him to be the director on the sequel to Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back.
And of course, in the interim between Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back, you won the Academy Award, which I know in your book you stated that you thought it was a bit of a surprise. You weren't quite expecting that.
Well, we had been nominated for an Eddie Award, which is what the editors give. Mm-hmm. And we didn't win that. So I thought, well, it's unlikely this guy from New York and the editor, the director's wife, and I thought we're not gonna win, but we did.
Yeah, it's well deserved, to say the least. And there are a couple of other films on your resume that you probably should have been nominated and won for as well, but that's another story. So we'll get into The Empire Strikes Back. I think it was early in 1979, and you were actually in London, I think, during the production. And I know you stated several times in your book that it gets to be a little bit boring when you are on a film set, that you prefer to just, maybe visit and then wait till the footage starts coming in and you can get the ball rolling, doing what you do best. And
yeah, so, I like to be busy, and I really have no particular function when I'm on the set. I can
Mm-hmm.
really only be busy when I'm, in my cutting room working. I mean, I like to visit the set. It's fun for a little while, but everyone else has a job to do, and I'm just an observer. So I can only keep you interested for so long.
Yeah, sure. I can imagine that, and of course, they're very long days. Of course, I'm sure, and it's a lot of tediousness going on as they are, setting up and taking down and setting up and all that type of stuff.
Yeah.
But you were there during the first couple of weeks, I think, if memory serves from your book.
Well, actually, the first bit that they shot was the second unit in Norway. They went and
Mm-hmm.
shot the Hoth battle scenes, the plates for the battle scenes, and the soldiers in snow uniforms and so forth. So that was the first shooting that took place, and I was not involved in the Norway stuff. But I came on when they got back from Norway and started shooting on the lot at Boreham Wood in England.
So I was just curious about the time frame of the shooting of the film. How
Yeah.
long that the actual shooting process? We know it was released, of course, in May of 1980, and we're talking around April of 1979 when you first got there, I believe, if I remember correctly. So.
Right. So the film was scheduled to shoot over 16 weeks,
Mhm.
and we arrived in I guess it was around March 1st, something like that. So we expect, or mid-February, something along those
Mhm.
lines, and so we expected to be going home around June, the end of mid to the end of June. After a week, Gary Kurz came to me. He says, "I think we're going to be here an extra week, so plan on being here for an extra week." So another week went by. He says, "I think it's going to be actually 2 weeks, not 1 week longer." And then it kept, the, the, the horizon kept moving away. The closer we got to it, the longer, the further away it got. And they wound up shooting 29 weeks
Mhm.
instead of 60. For tax reasons, I had to leave the country before 26 weeks were up, because if you um, spend more than half the year in the UK, you have to pay taxes there. So anyway, so I was sent back to the United States just before my 26 weeks would have been up, and the last 3 weeks of shooting I wasn't around for.
Mm. Barely missed it, as they say. Oh, well, now you actually did the cutting back in America. Is that correct? Or when you started actually putting the film together, was that done after you'd
Well, I
gotten
do
back?
that. I do that every day during production. I mean, normally when the film is not shot in sequence, there
Right.
are production reasons for scheduling one scene before another. Availability of actors. If you bring an actor for 2 weeks, you want to shoot all his scenes within those 2 weeks. So, or availability of a location, you have to be in and out in 2 days, whatever. So there are various reasons why pictures are shot out of order.
Hmm.
But usually, when a scene is shot, like a location has to be finished in 2 days, after those 2 days, there's never going to be any more material for that sequence. So there's no reason not to start putting that sequence together.
Hmm.
So that's what we do. So as the film is being shot, I'm putting together the first cut of the picture scene by scene. And eventually, first there are gaps and things out of order, and then eventually all the gaps are filled in, and you have a whole first cut. And the idea is to put everything in there, stand it up on its feet so you can take a look at it and see what you're dealing with before you start making editing decisions.
Hmm.
So this process is one that I think of as building. I'm building the picture while they're shooting it.
Yeah, I probably didn't make myself clear. What I guess what I meant to say was, did you finish the film when you got back to America? Were you able to? I'm sure there was some stuff that you weren't able to get completed in time before you had to come back to America.
Yeah, well, I'm usually able. especially when I started working on computers, which was not the case on Empire Strikes Back, but I was usually able to keep up with camera pretty much, and traditionally I was able to deliver a cut of the film 1 week after the end of principal photography. That would be the first cut. The first is really the beginning of the editing process, when you have the whole thing in front of you and you start making decisions about what you need and what you don't need. And yeah, so in the case of Empire, it was a simple matter to, we had, the film came in so slowly that I was able to show the cut, virtually as soon as they got back from England. And then we locked the picture 1 month later. By that, I mean no further changes. When we watched the picture for the first time, George liked to watch a picture twice. He'd like to watch it once without taking any notes, just to watch the picture, have an experience, and experience the whole thing. And then that'd be in the morning. Then you break for lunch, you come back and you watch the picture a second time, and then you start making notes about things that you thought were unnecessary, in the wrong place, to, whatever the note is. It goes too fast, it goes too slow, it's in the wrong place, we don't need it, whatever the concerns are. And then everyone took their notes. George, Hirsch, Gary Kurtz, Marcia, Larry Kasdan, who had written the screenplay, and myself. And then we put it up on the chem, the same group, we put it on the chem and go through it. And when anyone had a note to give, we would stop and we'd have a discussion about it. George was the final arbiter whether I should do the note or not. In my recollection, I don't think he ever overruled Kirsch. Whatever Kirsch wanted to change, George said, yes, do it. So I think Kirsch was happy with the outcome.
Yeah, that brings up another question I had, actually, because I know there was a little bit of a tension between Lucas and Kurtz and Kirshner, because I think Gary Kurtz was taking the side of Irving Kirshner, who was he had his reasons. His pace was a little slower than what Lucas wanted, I believe, and Lucas was trying to rush him, and there was a little tension there, and so I was going to get you to talk maybe a little.
The tension resulted from, a schedule of 16 weeks ballooning into 29. And George was paying for the picture out of his own pocket. He was financing the film this time. And he was feeling a lot of pressure because he was basically rolling the dice with his own fortune to pay for the movie. And he was not happy about what he considered to be, I guess he considered wasted money, taking too much time and so forth. That's an ordinary kind of situation. I mean, it's not a personal animosity or anything like that. It's just, the business needs versus the director who works a certain way or whatever,
Yeah, I didn't know if that led to maybe his parting company with Gary Kurtz when they went on to do Return of the Jedi, or because they had some disagreements there, or maybe it was Gary Kurtz's decision. But
what do you mean? Because I believe Gary produced Jedi, didn't he?
I was thinking it was Howard.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, that's who it was. It was.
I don't know what happened there. I was not invited back because George hired an English director who insisted on his own editor, which I think is commendable, frankly. I think loyalty is a nice quality. And, I was disappointed not to get the job, but I understood, and he had good reasons.
Yeah. I know he wanted to use a British crew, and that was one of the reasons why I think he brought in Mark Wand to direct, I believe.
Yes, exactly.
So, yeah. Yeah, well, now there's an interesting story about a teaser trailer that you were commissioned to put together, I believe.
Yes.
That's an interesting story if you don't mind sharing that.
Yeah, sure. Gary came by the cutting room one day. He said, "We're going to need a trailer for the movie." And I said, "Yeah." And I said, is there a script for it? He said, no, but just, start thinking about it. I said, well, we don't have any film yet. He said, well, just think about it. So uh, the film was coming in kind of slowly. I was usually able to cut everything from the day before by lunchtime. So I thought, I should work on this trailer because I know they're going to ask me for it soon. I better get ready for it. So I had worked in trailers when I was coming up. So I wrote a little script myself and put together a trailer with the few shots that I had at the time. And I stole some graphic of Star Wars. I forget. Maybe I took it from a Star Wars trailer. I forget where I got it, but anyway, I used the music from Star Wars and the few shots that I had and the script that I'd written, and I cut together this trailer. And I needed an announcer to read the script so I could play it over the action. And I wanted an American voice because it was an American film, and so at that time, Mark Hamill was his wife Mary Lou was expecting their first child, and Mark had been asked so many times about, has the baby come yet? Has the baby come yet? He started wearing a sign around his neck saying, "Don't ask." He had a cardboard sign. All it said was, "Don't ask." And he was getting a little touchy about, all the questions about Mary Lou, how's she doing, and all this. So anyway, so I decided to just steer clear of Mark, and I looked up Harrison. And I said, Harrison, I need a favor. I need an announcer for this trailer that I'm cutting. And he said, how much are they paying you? I said, paying me? They're not paying me anything. He says, what? That's not right. I said, well, they're not. He says, you need an American actor. I said, yeah. He says, and you don't have too much choice, do you? I said, no, I don't. He said, so he agreed to do it. So he knocked off the narration in half an hour. At the end of the day, we went into a studio on the lot. So I mixed it together and I sent it off to California, and I got a phone call from one of George's assistants. He said, George loves the trailer and he loves the announcer. Who is that? We'd like to hire him for the final. So I said, well, that's Harrison. He said, who? I said, Harrison Ford, one of the stars of the movie. And oh my gosh, I had Harrison play it like a newsboy calling out, extra, extra, read all about it. Sort of a, excited, up, loud, kind of very different from the Han Solo character, and he was playing it like a newsboy calling out an extra edition. So anyway, apparently the trailer is out there on the internet somewhere. I think you can find it on YouTube. My daughter told me, I thought it was lost, I thought it was gone and never seen again, because George tried it out on the exhibitors and they hated it. All the exhibitors, they thought it wasn't dignified enough, and I think one of the great things about the original film was how much pure fun it was. And I think that if there's a flaw in the later films, it's that they seem to have lost that element of fun. It got sort of self-important somehow. I'm not sure how or when that happened. When I heard back from California that George had liked the trailer, I went looking for Harrison. I found him outside a soundstage. I said, Harrison, we're a hit. They like us. He says, really? I said, yeah, they want to use you for the final. He said, wait, hold on. He says, they pay big money for that. And then he said, oh, that's when he asked me how much I was making on the for cutting it. I said, I'm not making anything. He said, what? He said, I'll tell you what, I'm gonna ask for $10,000 and I'm gonna give you half. So just that moment, Gary Kurtz came walking up and he said, Harrison, I wonder if I could talk to you for a second. And Harrison said, sure, Gary. He put his arm around it and he walked around his shoulders and he walked away. He gave me a little wink as he walked away. And he came back a few minutes later and he said to me, He said, I only had the nerve to ask him for $5,000. And about a week later, I got a check from Harrison for $2,500, which completely unsolicited. It was really a nice gesture. And yeah, I never forgot it.
Wow, that's a great story. Well, it's too bad that. Well, I mean, I'm glad that it's out there. I'm glad it's not totally lost. That people can actually see it. So that's a good thing. Although it unfortunately, didn't get the distribution you'd hoped, maybe. But anyway, I was curious about some of the challenges in editing Empire versus the challenges you had in Star Wars. I know the budget was definitely a little bit bigger. You had a little more leeway there, but still challenges, I'm sure. And I was just curious about that.
Yeah, bigger budget doesn't mean fewer challenges, really. I mean, think about it. If you have to choose between red and blue, it's pretty easy to make that choice. If you have a bigger budget and you can afford to buy more colors, now maybe you have 10 reds and 10 blues. So it takes you a little bit longer to decide if you like red or blue and which red and which blue, you know what I mean? The budget buys you a lot more choices, which makes the work more challenging. When you have limited choices, it makes your work simple in a way. And the other thing to remember is that I was hired to help out on Star Wars. The picture had already been edited, not a terrific first pass, I have to say. But I was re-editing from the get-go on Star Wars. Whereas Empire, I was doing the work from the ground up. I was cutting the first cut myself, and actually, that's easier for me. It's easier to get it right the first time than to try to figure out what's wrong with something and how to fix it, and being the editor during the production, I was able to see all the dailies and I was familiar with the material. And when you come in after the picture's been shot, it's impossible. It's almost impossible to really learn the material in the way that you would if you were on the picture every day. So yeah, it was Empire was one of these magical projects that the script was right, the shooting was done right, and we locked the picture 1 month after the end of principal photography, and it just worked. There wasn't a lot of fussing around and recutting and scratching our heads and trying to figure out how to solve problems. It was something that just really worked. And the other thing to remember about Empire Strikes Back is that it was a very bold and daring film in that it was the sequel to the biggest hit of all time, and yet it was not a carbon copy of the first film. You would have thought that a studio making a sequel to this, the first Star Wars would want a picture that had the same kind of formula. You'd have a problem, the heroes would solve it, and there'd be a big battle at the end, and they'd come out triumphant. Well, Empire turned it on its head, and they had the big battle in the opening scene, almost the opening scenes, and then it resolves very ambivalently at the end, ambiguously. It resolves very ambiguously at the end because it's really the end of a second act of a 3-act drama. And the thing about this end of the second act is you get your hero up a tree and then you set the tree on fire. That's how the second act is supposed to end. So it's not exactly a crowd pleaser to leave something as irresolute as the ending of Empire. Luke has had his hand cut off, although he gets a mechanical one back. And Vader is out there, and the audience had to wait 3 years to find out what would happen next. So it was a very daring and bold choice to make the picture as it was. I don't think that's appreciated today to the degree that it was very risky. And in fact, it didn't make as much as the first film, and it didn't make as much as the third film, because I think what I outlined is the reason why.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Um, but it's funny how, in hindsight, people think that it's one of the best sequels of all time, obviously, and it's a film that, when people cite one of the best episodes of the series, that's the one they always go to. Maybe the one they always go to. Sometimes, in some cases, even more so than the original Star Wars. So it has, the choices he made have proven him right over time, I guess you would say. Um, so wise choices, but like you said at the time, very risky. Nevertheless, did you have any specific advantages when you were cutting Empire over what you had in Star Wars? Was there anything that was made life a little easier for you, I should say?
Yeah, well, not to get too wonky about it, but on the first film, they had used an English slating system, which made my work as the editor very complicated. And on the sequel, on Empire, I had them use the American slating system. And I won't go into too much detail about it, but it made my life enormously easier working that way. Yeah, as I say, it's an advantage for me to be the editor from the get-go and not be recutting somebody else's work.
Yeah, and you were the last one on Star Wars as well, so you kind of were there, like you said, working with what they had already done. This was a totally different thing, and yet you made it your own for sure. In both cases, I think it definitely has the hallmarks of what we know from seeing your other work. It's there. I can see it anyway, if nobody else can. So
Thank you. I will say this: the first day they shot with Vader, I saw the dailies from the first day, and I ran to the set and I said, "There's something wrong with the helmet. This is not. It doesn't look right." And we looked at the days shootings from the day before. And we looked at old pictures, and they had it too high in the back, so they adjusted it and they got it sitting properly, and then we were okay from that point on. But I thought if I hadn't been so familiar with the way Vader looked, I wouldn't have caught it, you know.
yeah, now that's an interesting story. Um, yeah, I was curious about also were there any specific scenes that you had to say goodbye to for whatever reason that you hated to see go, or not? I'm always curious about the things that hit the cutting room floor, if there's anything that really pained.
You know, I don't remember anything like that. It was a script that really worked. And of course, you know, Adam, it was 40 years ago. So,
Yes, it was. That's true.
but a lot of pictures since then. I don't remember any particular scenes that we cut out, really. I haven't,
Yeah.
you know, I thought the stuff with R2 on, not R2, with C3PO on the Wookiee's back as they're making their escape from Cloud City. I thought that
Hmm.
was all wonderfully comic stuff. And I think Kirsch helped uh, keep the comic and fun feeling of the first film alive in the second one. I think some of the work that he did with the relationship between Han and Chewbacca, some really, you know, wonderful comic stuff, and the 3PO Anthony Daniels on Chewie's back, even though it wasn't you know, it was Anthony's voice and a
Hmm.
puppet, but still all that stuff is really um, wonderful stuff. He worked really well with developing those characters.
Yeah. Did you actually get to witness Frank Oz while he was there doing the Yoda puppet? I couldn't remember if you were actually there or were witness to any of that.
Well, yeah, but except that Frank was under the floor. He was shooting on a platform, and
Yes.
the puppet was sitting on the floor of the platform, and Frank was under the floor with his hand up inside Yoda and watching his performance on a little monitor next to him under the floor. So I couldn't hear very well because, I guess maybe I did. I forget. When you visit a set, they always give you a pair of earphones so you can hear the dialogue. It's sort of standard now. I'm not sure that was the practice 40 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But like I say, if you visit the set, there wasn't much to see of what Frank was doing. You'd see
Right.
the effect, but you wouldn't see, unless you were under the floor, you wouldn't see what he was doing. And I think there were a few other, one or two other people helping him, moving the hand, or he didn't do all the parts of the puppet himself. There were other puppeteers working with him. But
Mm-hmm.
of course, I did meet Frank, and I also met Jim Henson, who came to visit one day, and that was exciting.
Questions unrelated to Empire Strikes Back, I just have to ask you while I have you, and one of which is a question that has been burning on my mind for 20 years, I would say at least, and it's in regards to planes, trains, and automobiles.
Yes,
And I know that the original cut was very long. You've mentioned that
yes,
several times. And I know that towards the end of the film, John Candy has a black eye. And
yes.
and I never could figure out why he has a black eye towards the end of the film, because it's a joke that obviously was cut from the film. And I didn't know if you could recall that or
Wait, doesn't
uh,
Steve at the end of the highway sequence?
yeah, they didn't really make it clear as to, because it happened somewhere along the after they're busted in the car by the state trooper, and then it just after
No,
the
before that. Before that, the
okay,
night
maybe
shot.
maybe
The night
okay,
before, when the car burns up, Steve is holding Candy by the lapels. He's shaking him back and forth.
okay, yes.
Doesn't that end with him punching him in the face?
I know he slugs him in the gut. There's a scene where he punches him in the gut, but I don't recall him punching him in the face. But maybe it's done so quickly that I've never. But I just it's there, it isn't there, and then it is there. And I was wondering if there was something else that I was missing, and maybe I'm not. Maybe it's all there, and I just didn't.
Well, we cut out so much stuff. I mean, we cut out more than we left in. So inevitably there are going to be some gaps in the
Mm-hmm.
continuity. And, all I can say is when, when rug makers in the Middle East make a rug, they always leave in an imperfection, because to try to make the rug perfect would be an affront to Allah. And the imperfections in the rug are a reflection of our own imperfections as human beings. So any imperfection in the continuity of planes, trains, and automobiles is a reflection of our imperfection as humans.
That's great. That's great.
So I
Um,
beg your indulgence.
well, I love the film. I love it, and I love your work on it again. There's just
Thank you.
so much great stuff there, and it's a perennial favorite here. It has been for 30 plus years. So what can I tell you?
Tell
Um,
me, have you seen it in a theater with an audience around you?
I have, but it was during its original release in '87. Yeah, I'm old enough to have been there. So yeah, I was there, but
I,
yeah, it's been a long time.
I was at a screening of it in Chicago in, I guess it was November of last year. And we had an audience in a theater. And the experience of watching it that way with a live crowd, sitting in a live crowd, is so different from watching it on your home system.
Mm-hmm.
It's a whole other experience in itself.
Yeah, it really is, and like I said, it's been so long. I haven't been able to catch it in a revival house, and I'm hoping that does happen one day. It was such a joy for me to share it with my children. as they were coming up. My daughter, I'll never forget the first time that I showed the film to her, and she literally fell out of her seat that she was sitting in. She was laughing so hard she fell onto the floor, on her hands and knees. I had to stop the film because it was to the point where we couldn't go any farther. And so when they got to the sequence where they're obviously driving on the highway in the opposite direction and that whole thing, she couldn't breathe. I had to stop the film. So so it lives on.
Huh?
Yeah, I said it lives on. It lives on through the generations is what I'm getting at. So
It would
yeah,
be nice if she could see it in a theater with a crowd. It's a whole different thing.
I'm gonna have to keep my eyes peeled for that. Hopefully, we can get past this Corona stuff, and then we can start. And maybe by the time that the Thanksgiving season rolls around, we'll be able to maybe find something.
I don't know. I'm not hopeful. I was reading about the 1918 epidemic lasted 3 years.
Oh, geez. I didn't know it was quite that long. Oh, hoping for the best. I know that's an old platitude and a cliche, but it's all we can do.
I worry that theaters may not be able to come back from this.
I have the same feeling. My producer and I, we do this show. We do just a regular show about twice a month, and on our last episode, we kind of scratched the surface on that. And I do think, and of course, what do I know? But and my full-time job, I'm in news media, so that's my day job. This is just a part-time thing for me. But I just based on what I'm seeing, I wonder if some of the theater chains might go bankrupt, unfortunately. And I hope.
I have a friend who does work for Netflix, and he was saying one of the executives there predicted that by the end of the year, 6,000 screens will have closed and never open again.
Oh my God, that's horrible.
Well, there are 25,000 screens, so it's like 25% of the theaters.
Yeah.
Not the, but the screens. Obviously there are multiple screens in each theater.
Mm-hmm.
So he thought 6,000 screens would go away and never come back.
Oh, Jesus, that's horrible to hear. And it's not. I don't think it's unfathomable. I think that's a realistic prediction. I really do. It's just it's very.
Under pressure. They're already under pressure from the streaming and the social media. Young kids today don't care about movies for terribly much. They're not that interested. They're interested in YouTube and Instagram and video games and Fortnite,
right.
And that's what's driving the culture today. It's not movies anymore.
Yeah, I think Joe Dante said it best. I heard him say in a recent interview, he said, the movies are a 20th century art form. Unfortunately, we don't live in the 20th century anymore. And I thought that was very prophetic to hear him say that. I'm still a movie guy. I will be there until they close the last theater. So I've been going since I was 4 years old, and that was a long time ago. So I don't plan on stopping.
Hey, that's the name of my book. A long time ago.
That's right. A long time ago in a cutting room far away. Yes, we want to get that plug in one more time for any of our listeners who are looking for a great book on the technique of editing, and like I said, also brimming with humanity as well. And one more thing before.
It's a fun read that'll get your mind off the current events.
Yes, absolutely.